Hello, welcome. We're just going to give it a few minutes to let everyone join. So we'll make a start in a couple of minutes. If you're just joining, we're just going to give it a couple of minutes for everyone to be able to be admitted, and then we'll make a start. I'm going to aim to start at 7:05, and that should give everyone enough time to join. Okay, so I make that 7:05, so I will make a start. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the HCSA's webinar on disability discrimination in the workplace. If you don't know me, my name is Isla Roberts. I'm one of the National Officers and Equalities Lead for the Hospital Doctors Union. I'm joined this evening by Govinda, Digital Engagement and Communications Officer, and my National Officer colleague, Salvatore. Now, before we begin, I wanted to go through some housekeeping rules. I wanted to make everyone aware that this session is being recorded, so if you want to turn your cameras off, you can, and will be uploaded onto our YouTube to view at a later date. Now, during the session, we do invite you to put forward any comments or questions, and towards the end of the session, if we have time, we will try and get through as many questions as possible. If you're not familiar, there is also a question and answer chat box on your screen, so you can also use that feature to put forward any questions for me if you have any. Now, if you do think of any questions, just type it in there and we will collect those questions and try to answer them at the end. And if we cannot or we run out of time to answer those questions during the session, then we will try and get back to people, or you can always contact me. Finally, just a reminder that this is a safe and respectful environment, so please respect the views and opinions of your colleagues. Now, I want to begin by giving an overview of the HCSA, the Hospital Doctors Trade Union, as I know this webinar is also being accessed by non-HCSA members. So you can find further information about us by visiting our website, www.hcsa.com. So who are we? The HCSA is the UK's only professional association and trade union focused solely on hospital doctors, wherever you are in your career. We can provide advice and representation, we champion policy and campaigning, and we also offer support, learning and advice. You can join us by viewing by using the QR code that is on the screen. Next slide, please, Govinda. So during this webinar, we're going to explore and dissect and also discuss the definition of disability, including the recent changes to the definition that have come in this year. We'll also determine what that means in practice and considerations for claimants or members. This webinar will aim to raise awareness on your rights when it comes to disability discrimination, to educate and inform you of your rights, and provide a general overview of some of the legal tests that can apply in disability discrimination cases and claims such as the failure to make reasonable adjustments. Next slide, please. So the existing definition of disability is comprised of 4 key tests, and it's covered within Section 6 of the Equality Act. Now, under this definition, a person is deemed to have a disability if, 1, they have either a physical or mental impairment. 2, that impairment must be long-term. So what we mean by that is it has lasted or is likely to last 12 months or more. The condition can be fluctuating and or recurring. The third element of the test is it must have a substantial and adverse effect. That means more than just a minor or trivial effect. Now, that doesn't mean that your condition has to stop you doing from something completely or from being able to carry out a particular function, but you may find it, for example, more difficult to carry out an activity. It might be painful for you to carry out such an activity. It might take you longer to carry out an activity, or you might need an aid or adaptation in order to support you to complete a particular activity. Now, the fourth element of the test is the impairment must be long-term and it must be substantial and have an adverse effect on your ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Now, when we look at normal day-to-day activities, what does that mean? That means normal everyday activities that we all do as human beings, which can be, for example, being able to cook, being able to eat, wash, dress and undress, walk or move around, being able to drive, being able to access and use public transport, being able to pay bills or read letters, use a telephone, the ability to communicate or concentrate, the ability to socialize or interact and participate in conversation, the ability to grip if, for example, you have difficulty sleeping or difficulty following instructions. These are all examples of day-to-day activities. Now, the definition of disability under the Equality Act is a very wide definition and includes invisible disabilities such as dyslexia, chronic migraines, diabetes, depression, for example. And we'll be covering invisible disabilities a little bit later on. Now, the key points for members and or claimants to be aware is you must have medical evidence to show that you meet those elements of the definition. It's also important to note that the legal test is based on the effect or impact on you without medication or treatment. The Act also protects you if you have a past disability or a progressive or recurring disability. Now, what is a unique feature of the equality legislation is that it does allow for a disabled person to be treated more favourably by their employer, which is sometimes termed positive discrimination. Now, under the Equality Act, there are a number of conditions which are termed deemed disabilities. If you have one of these conditions, that means you don't need to show that you meet the elements of the test under the definition. You simply need medical evidence confirming your diagnosis. Now, the deemed disabilities are cancer, blind or severely sight impaired, multiple sclerosis, HIV, or severe disfigurement. There are also a number of exclusions under the Equality Act, for example, hay fever, or the requirement to wear ordinary glasses or contact lenses, as well as a number of other things. Oh, yeah. Next slide, please, Belinda. Slide 5, please. Now, there has been a recent change made to the Equality Act, an amendment made this year, which doesn't necessarily introduce, oh, sorry, Govinda, slide 5, please. So there has been a change made to the Equality Act this year, which doesn't necessarily introduce new rights, but it does enable some of the rights that come directly from EU law to be maintained within UK law. And whilst it does allow for protection for employees to continue, it also provides legal clarity. So this amendment is, in addition to the 4 tests that I've just covered, this is essentially a 5th test, the ability to participate fully and effectively in working life on an equal basis with other workers. So what does that mean in practice? That means in addition to the usual test, the 4 elements that I've just covered, the claimant will now also have to show that they are not able to fully participate effectively in working life on an equal basis with other workers who are not disabled. In principle, this is an additional burden on claimants who need to show that not only does their condition affect their normal day-to-day activities outside of work, but also now within work. Now, what does that mean in practice? It can mean that when they look at your activities within work, that it can include things, for example, sitting at a desk, sitting in examination for promotion, but it also depends on the role of your job. So it could include, for example, working at night or being able to lift heavy items. Next slide, please. Now, disability as a protected characteristic under the Equality Act is the only protected characteristic which has 6 different types of disability discrimination claims. And for that reason, it is a unique feature of disability. So we're going to talk about the 6 types now, but I'll run through them first. So we've got direct disability discrimination. We've got indirect disability discrimination. We've also got harassment, the failure to make reasonable adjustments, discrimination arising from disability, and finally, the victimization. So on the slide, you can see direct disability discrimination is covered within Section 13 of the Equality Act. And essentially, that is where you are being treated less favourably or unfavourably simply because you are disabled. So there's some examples there. So an employer refusing to employ you because you've got a previous history of cancer, for example, or your employer refusing to employ you because you have a history of mental illness. The second type, indirect disability discrimination, is covered within Section 19 of the Equality Act, and that is where a provision, criterion, or practice, sometimes termed a PCP, which basically means a rule or way of doing things, that could be a policy, is subjecting you to a substantial disadvantage because of your disability. And the example there is using sickness absence to decide scores in redundancy. The third type of disability discrimination is harassment, and that's covered under Section 26 of the Equality Act. And that's where you experience unwanted conduct related to your disability, which has the purpose or effect of creating an offensive, intimidating, hostile, humiliating, and degrading environment. The example given there is mocking someone's stammer. And that was actually a real case that I've dealt with previously. The fourth type of disability discrimination is discrimination arising from disability. Now that's covered within Section 15, and it's essentially where you're treated unfavourably for a reason connected to your disability. So that could be the requirement to need reasonable adjustments or have reasonable adjustments implemented. It could be because of your sickness absence that's connected to disability, for example. The fifth type is probably one of the most common types of disability discrimination that we come across, and that's the failure to make reasonable adjustments, which is covered under Section 20 and 21 of the Equality Act. And that is where your employer is required to make reasonable adjustments if you experience a substantial disadvantage because of your disability, and that adjustment is needed to remove or minimise that disadvantage. The final type of disability discrimination is victimisation, and that's covered under Section 27 of the Equality Act. And that's essentially where you are subjected to a detriment because you have taken steps to challenge discrimination. So the example given there is subjecting a doctor to an unreasonable and or unjustified disciplinary action because they've complained about discrimination. Could be that they've raised a grievance complaining about discrimination or the failure to make reasonable adjustments, for example. Now, it is only in the case of direct disability discrimination claims that a comparator is required. Now, essentially, is a comparator with someone who is a comparator is someone with the same abilities but without the disability. And again, you only need to show that in direct disability discrimination claims. Now, the comparator can be an actual comparator if you actually know a person, or it can be a hypothetical comparator. You don't need a comparator in any of the other types of disability discrimination claims, but they can be useful. Next slide, please. We're now going to cover the duty to make reasonable adjustments. And as I mentioned, this is probably one of the most common types of disability discrimination that we see. So what does the duty to make reasonable adjustments mean? So the basics, it's essentially where your employer is required to make changes, termed reasonable adjustments, to remove any substantial disadvantage that you face as an employee in the workplace. Now, this duty arises whenever there is an aspect of your job, so that could be a working practice, it could also be a physical feature of your job, which places you at a significant disadvantage when compared to a colleague or another employee who is not disabled. Now, this is a statutory right, so a failure to comply with the duty to make reasonable adjustments constitutes discrimination under the Equality Act. The only or one of the only defences is if the employer lacks knowledge of your disability. The requirement to make reasonable adjustments is also an active duty, which means that your employer is required to take positive action to remove any certain disadvantages that you posed by you as a disabled person, or a rule or way of doing things or working practice. Now, what's important to note is there is no duty to make reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act to enable a non-disabled worker to look after a disabled relative. So unfortunately, carers do not have the right to reasonable adjustments. It's also important to know that you should not be required to pay for any reasonable adjustments. And if you're not sure about what reasonable adjustments may be suitable for you, you can get help and determine what reasonable adjustments may be helpful by speaking to any of your relevant medical professionals. You may also be able to seek support from Access to Work scheme, occupational health, and even a disability rights advisor if there is one in your local area. Now, the key thing to remember when it comes to the duty to make reasonable adjustments, you are not entitled to reasonable adjustments simply because you are disabled. When it comes to this specific type of claim, you need to be able to show that it is a need and not a want or a preference. You need this reasonable adjustment to remain in work or return to work, and not simply that it would help. So the test when it comes to reasonable adjustment is that the employer must take steps that is reasonable to avoid the disadvantage. And again, the employer must have knowledge of disability. So what we mean by that is it could be that you've disclosed your condition in an email. It could be that you provided a GP fit note and it's detailed on there in a GP letter or other medical evidence, such as an occupational health report. Ideally, the evidence needs to be in writing. Again, we have the PCP, so that's the provision, criterion, or practice. Another way of saying it is a policy, a rule, a way of doing things, a physical feature, which puts you as the disabled person at a substantial disadvantage. Now, the provision, criterion, or practice is widely interpreted by both the legislation and case law. So it can include informal policies, formal policies, practices, procedures, and certain ways that the employer does things, even if it's a custom or practice. Now, when we unpick the duty to make reasonable adjustments, we have to stress the word reasonable. So what does that mean? What is reasonable? So we look at, is it practical to provide the adjustment? How much will it cost? are we able to get funding for that cost? But that is not your responsibility, that's the employer's responsibility. The extent of the employer's resources, the nature and size of the employer, and or whether there is a physical feature that's putting you at a substantial disadvantage. Next slide, please, Govinda. So still covering reasonable adjustments, you need to be able to say, as the disabled employee, which policy or procedure, rule or way of doing things is causing you the disadvantage at work. You then need to be able to say how that disadvantage is linked to your disability and what changes you think your employer should make to the policy or procedure and how that change will stop you being at a disadvantage. So the right to reasonable adjustments is a day one right, and it also applies to job applicants. So even if before you've started a job, and you have this entitlement if you're a substantive employee, but also if you're a worker, if you're a trainee, if you're an agency worker, and those employed under a service contract, such as fixed term employees and or locums. You don't need a substantive contract or 2-year service to be entitled to reasonable adjustments. And as I mentioned, it is a statutory right under UK law. So just to conclude, the reasonable adjustments duty is a duty on employers to remove any disadvantage that you face in the workplace and consider any reasonable adjustments that allows you to return to work if you've been off sick or remain in work. And it does require your employer to treat a disabled person more favourably to remove that disadvantage. Now, the duty to make reasonable adjustments is divided into 3 key categories, which are framed or considered as requirements. I've not put them on a slide because there's quite a lot to it, so I'm going to summarise. Criteria 1, where a provision, criteria or practice puts you as a disabled person at a substantial disadvantage compared with people who are not disabled. The employer must then take steps that are reasonable to avoid that disadvantage, and remember, the provision, criterion or practice covers almost anything the employer does which affects you as the worker. That could be how they apply attendance and training policies, selection criteria for recruitment or promotion, or even redundancy procedures, how they impose job duties and deadlines, how they impose formal policies such as disciplinary policies, and rest breaks, and even the hours in your working day. So that's criteria 1. Criteria 2, to be entitled to reasonable adjustments, is where a physical feature puts you as the disabled person at a substantial disadvantage compared with those who are not disabled. Then the employer must take reasonable steps to avoid that disadvantage by removing or altering the feature. Now, when we talk about physical features, that can be a temporary or permanent change, and it includes both internal and external features, such as steps, exits, parking areas, for example, doors, toilets, lighting and ventilation, floor coverings, furniture, and signs. Now, the final feature under criteria 3 is where a disabled person would, but for the provision of an auxiliary aid, be put at a substantial disadvantage compared with people who are not disabled. The employer must then take reasonable steps to provide that auxiliary aid. Now, what does an auxiliary aid mean? It means something which provides support or assistance to a disabled person, such as, for example, a specialist piece of equipment. It could be an adapted keyboard or mouse. Next slide, please, Govinda. So on your screen, you should see a list of some examples of reasonable adjustments. I'm going to give you all a chance to read those in a second. I just want to make you aware these are all example real reasonable adjustments that we have secured for members in either former or current ongoing cases. So I'll give everyone a minute just to read those listed on the screen. Now, the type or feature of reasonable adjustment that you may need will depend on the impact and effect your disability has on you. So to give you an example, you might have two people who have diabetes, but the impact of diabetes on one person may differ on the other one, including medication, treatment, and time off. So therefore, no two cases, no matter the similarities, will be the same, and each case must always be looked at on an individual case-by-case basis. I'm now going to ask you to answer a poll question, and it's a question on what conditions listed do you think is an invisible disability? So if you can all take a minute to answer that poll question now, please. And once you've all had a chance to answer that question, Govinda will share the results with us. Okay, so almost all of them quite high figures. That's interesting. Essentially, it was a trick question because all the conditions listed are all invisible disabilities. Next slide, please, Govinda. So what is an invisible disability? In practice, it is a disability that is not obvious to others, sometimes called non-visible, invisible, or hidden disabilities. And these are conditions which may be intermittent or fluctuate in their effects, but will still entitle the person to protection under the Equality Act at all times, provided that the condition is likely to recur. So even if at a particular point in time the condition is dormant, for example, depression is a good example of such an invisible disability. Now remember, the definition of disability is based on the impact or effect without medication or treatment. So even if a person is receiving treatment for their depression, for example, it is based on the impact or effect without medication. Next slide, please, Govinda. We're now going to talk about raising concerns about mental health, because I think there's still today, there's some stigma attached to mental health, unfortunately, and there's this fear or assumption that if you disclose to your employer that you are struggling with mental health, you'll be automatically referred to the GMC, for example, or subjected to unfair and unreasonable capability proceedings, which might impact your ability to be a doctor. Now, if that happens, that, depending on the facts, is likely to be discrimination, and your employer is required to treat your disclosure of mental health and treat it seriously with the same care and or support offered as any physical illness. It's important to note, as with any condition, that your mental health condition needs to be documented and there needs to be medical evidence. Now, one of the concerns when it comes to mental health is it's sometimes not documented because people, for whatever reason, may not go to their GP for help. So getting that evidence is really important. You can also seek input from occupational health and or practitioner health. So an example of that is stress. Now, stress generally, including workplace stress, is not generally classed as a medical condition or a disability, but it can be. And refer you back to the 5 elements of the disability definition that we talked about earlier. Stress can also have a significant impact on your mental health and or any existing medical conditions. Now, when it comes to you disclosing your mental health, for example, there's no obligation for you to suggest any support or reasonable adjustments. But if you know or can think of any adjustments that might help, it may be useful to discuss them with your employer. And your employer is also required to carry out an assessment, including a risk assessment, to identify any suitable adjustments or support needs to help you with your mental health. Your employer should also always consult with you before implementing any adjustments to make sure that they're suitable for you. And sometimes it's possible to trial reasonable adjustments as well. Remember, it always goes back to that individual case-by-case approach. Next slide, please. We're now going to talk a little bit more about discrimination arising from disability. And after the failure to make reasonable adjustments, this is probably the second most common type of disability discrimination that we see. Now, I want to remind you that doctors need to be able to show that employers are aware and or reasonably aware that you have the protected characteristic of disability in order to show this type of discrimination. And as a reminder, it's where you experience unfavourable treatment because of something arising as a consequence of your disability. So something connected to your disability, not because you're disabled, because you might need time off or you might need treatment for your disability. Now, there is a defence if your employer can show a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. That essentially means that even with the reasonable adjustment, it might not be healthy and safe for you to do the job still. But this comes back to the failure to make reasonable adjustments. Your employer is still required to consider if there are any reasonable adjustments that would enable you to remain employed or return to work. Your employer must always consider whether there are reasonable adjustments. For example, lighter duties, a different role, flexible working, additional rest breaks, making adaptations to the workplace, providing specialist equipment. And if your employer's identified issues with your conduct, for example, they should also consider whether your behaviour is connected to your disability and whether any reasonable adjustments should be made to policy. Otherwise, it could be discrimination arising from disability if you're dismissed. So a common example is where you are absent because of and on sick leave because of your disability, and especially where that sickness is due to a disability, there are several actions an employer should be taking to manage that absence and allowing you or enabling you as the worker to return to work. Next slide, please. Now, we're now going to talk about the consideration for members or claimants if you are thinking about challenging disability discrimination. So a common feature is what outcome do you want as the claimant? Now, usually it's for the discrimination to stop, or more often than not, to have the reasonable adjustment implemented. We also need to consider whether you are in time to take any action. Now, the time limits for legal action are very short and incredibly strict, and that is 3 months less 1 day, or within 3 months less 1 day of the date of the discriminatory action, decision, or conduct. Now, when that 3 months runs from will depend on the type of claim you're making and also depend on what's happened. We also need to consider what is the detriment. Now, sometimes there might be a financial detriment. So, for example, if because your employer is not implementing the reasonable adjustments and you've exhausted your sick pay, there can be a financial detriment, but there can also be other types of detriment as well. People also need to consider the costs and expense of taking any action, including legal action, and the time it takes to take action. It can be incredibly time consuming to challenge discrimination, even if you are not challenging it legally. Members and claimants also need to consider, can you handle the stress and commitment? It can be very daunting. It can also be very stressful to challenge discrimination. And there is always a risk that you could lose your job or be victimized. So we would always strongly advise that you seek advice early and get that support in early. We also need to consider what evidence that you've got. So written evidence is always better if possible. So we'll look at documents, emails, text messages, for example. There is also always a risk that you could get a bad reference. No matter how strong the case, there's always a risk that you could lose the case. And members and claimants need to be aware that the only likely outcome at an employment tribunal is compensation. So if the outcome that you want is, for example, for the discrimination to stop or for the reasonable adjustment to be implemented, there are usually other ways to get those things without the need for legal action. This can be mediation or enforcing in-house policies. And even if you are planning on taking legal action, it's useful to do those things to secure or gather evidence. It can also identify witnesses. Now, if you're making a formal complaint about discrimination, such as raising a grievance, or if your employer is subjecting you to disciplinary action and the subjecting you to disciplinary action is the discrimination itself, the employer is required to follow something called the ACAS Code of Practice covering grievances and disciplinary action. And if your employer fails to do that, as well as follow any internal policy, that can support, reinforce, or even strengthen your discrimination claim. And depending on the facts, it can also increase compensation. Claimants also need to consider whether they can meet the burden of proof test. So what does that mean? It's a balance of probability test, and essentially in practice, what it means is you need to be able to show it was more likely than not that discrimination occurred. And finally, all judgments of the Employment Tribunal are now publicly available and published online on the Tribunal database. So that means your name and the name of your employer, if your case succeeds or loses, will be available online. Next slide, please. We're now going to cover some case studies. Now, these are all real and fairly recent case studies in members' cases that we've supported. So the first case was a consultant who had epilepsy, who had been medically advised to implement over 20 reasonable adjustments, which had included increased home working to complete SPAs, for example, and extra breaks. Now, prior to our involvement, the member had found it extremely difficult to gain the necessary support and even identify what reasonable adjustments that they needed. Now, following our involvement, where we supported this member in meetings and secured occupational health input, we were able to secure the implementation of all but I think it was 3 of the 20 plus. It was all but 3 of those reasonable adjustments. And the only reason that the outstanding 3 adjustments weren't implemented is because it was identified that the other adjustments removed that disadvantage. In the second case study, we supported a junior doctor who was struggling with managing her ADHD and associated symptoms, which were having a negative impact on her training and exams. So we supported this member and we were able to secure the deanery to agree to fund expert medical assessments, and we secured reasonable adjustments for this member to have during her examinations, including, for example, extra breaks and a second screen. The final case study included there is we supported a member who had a long-term health condition, which meant that they could not walk long distances as it could cause breathing and mobility difficulties. As a result, we were able to secure a designated parking permit for this member as a reasonable adjustment, which meant that the member did not have to worry about finding a parking space and did not have to walk very far from their car to the workplace each day. Next slide, please. I'm going to unpick a little bit more about what disability discrimination could be in practice. So giving a negative verbal reference or withdrawing a job offer can also be disability discrimination. So giving a negative verbal reference because of a former employee's disability-related absence may amount to discrimination arising from disability. So too could the subsequent withdrawal of a job offer. So in the case listed in paragraph 2, the employer's disability meant that she had a number of lengthy absences and regularly needed to work from home. The Employment Appeal Tribunal held that the former employee's negative verbal reference and the prospective employer's subsequent withdrawal of the job offer both amounted to discrimination arising from disability. And in the final case listed there, the Court of Appeal also held that dismissing an employee for disability-related absences that triggered the application of a formal attendance policy could also constitute discrimination arising from disability. Next slide, please. So this is a fairly recent case, and in this case, the Employment Appeal Tribunal found that the performance review and dismissal of an employee with dyspraxia was disability discrimination. And this was because reasonable adjustments to allow this employee the chance of achieving an acceptable performance in her work had not been made. So this is just a reminder and to stress that employers have to consider making all reasonable adjustments to enable an employee's performance to improve before instigating any performance review. So remember, going back to the duty to make reasonable adjustments, it's to enable you to remain and or return to work. Next slide, please. So to conclude, we would always strongly suggest that you seek advice without delay, not just because the time limits are short, but also if we can act quickly, it can usually avoid the need for any legal action. So contact the HCSA if you need support and advice, if you're a member. I would also strongly recommend that where appropriate, you keep a diary logging changes in your health, medication symptoms, logging incidents, for example, and try to include as much detail as possible. Include dates, times, full names of potential witnesses, medical professionals involved. It's also really important to update your medical records, and you can do this by speaking to your GP, by obtaining involvement of occupational health, and also seeking support from practitioner health. And it's always important to collate and obtain existing medical advice so you've got that to hand. And finally, just to stress, seek advice early. Next slide, please. So we're now going to have a discussion. I know that we have been provided with some common questions. So I'm going to ask my colleague Sal to read out 3 of those questions, and then if we have time, I'll also try and cover any questions in the chat box.
Thanks, Isla. So the first question is what if I don't have a lot of medical evidence? How can I get more medical evidence?
So my response to that would be, in addition to keeping a journal or diary logging your symptoms and any change in your symptoms, for example, including if they've worsened, including if your medication has changed or increased, you can contact your GP, and sometimes at a charge, your GP will be willing to provide you with a supporting letter or make additional notes on your fit note, for example. If you also currently are seeking support from a nurse or another medical professional, you can also see if they are willing to provide you with medical evidence. It's also really important that you seek the input of occupational health, because even if you feel that occupational health isn't that supportive, their reports and the medical evidence that they can provide can be really useful. Doctors can also consider approaching practitioner health to gain support and potentially further medical evidence. I am aware of cases of where practitioner health have provided supporting letters or similar. Now, depending on your health condition and or disability that you have, you can also consider contacting any relevant organisations or charities associated with your disability for further support. There are various charities and dedicated organisations linked to, for example, neurodiversity, arthritis, diabetes, epilepsy, and mental health conditions, for example. Now, doctors and employers shouldn't underestimate the weight of a GP support letter. If that's accepted and recognised by the court, it should be accepted and recognised by your employer. Now, bear in mind, the charge for this letter will differ and depend on your GP service, but it can be extremely useful medical evidence as part of trying to secure or identify any reasonable adjustments.
Thanks, Isla. And also, what is the most common type of disability discrimination that we as the HCSA deal with?
I think I mentioned this before, but I would say that it is the failure to make reasonable adjustments. That's it was the 5th claim that I mentioned. It's probably the most common type of disability discrimination that we deal with. Now, remember, this type of discrimination claim covers not only a failure or refusal to implement a reasonable adjustment, but can also cover, for example, the delay to implement the adjustment, the failure to amend or disregard a relevant rule or policy, or apply adjustments in processes or proceedings that puts a doctor at a disadvantage because of their disability.
Fantastic. And also, just the third question really is, how do I get help if I believe that I'm experiencing disability discrimination?
So if you are a HCSA member, please seek advice by contacting us. Members can access advice from us by using the contact form on our website. Now, depending on the facts, in addition to support from us, members can also seek support from, as already discussed, occupational health, medical professionals, practitioner health, but also from the Access to Work scheme or a local disability rights advisor. I would also say that you should check if your employer or trust is registered as a disability confident employer under the government's disability confidence scheme. Now, the disability confidence scheme aims to help employers to think differently about disability and take action to improve how they recruit, retain, and develop disabled people, and to identify organisations who are committed to inclusion and diversity in the workplace. So also check any internal policies as well. So I'm just going to review the chat box. Someone's
there is some really there's some really good ones that have come through.
Okay.
I think how long could a period for disability leave be is quite a good one.
So to answer that question, I would say that's a difficult question to answer because it's on a case-by-case basis. Now, there is case law to say that, for example, in one case where the claimant was off sick for near or approaching 2 years, and then was subjected to disciplinary proceedings and ultimately dismissed, was still disability discrimination. So it's on a case-by-case basis, but there's no hard or fast rule as to how long a period of disability leave can be.
Fantastic. And what is the role and use of a stress risk assessment? Does that support the need for reasonable adjustments or impact upon mental health if they fail to address the stressors?
Yes, definitely. So a stress risk assessment should be able to identify any stressors and what can be done to limit, reduce, or minimize those stressors. Now, the stress risk assessment shouldn't be taken in isolation. The member or claimant should still get advice from occupational health and other medical professionals. The stress risk assessment forms a process that should be done overall, but yes, it can be really useful.
Fantastic. And there's another one here, which is really, really good. As a carer of children with disabilities, are you entitled to adjustments?
So unfortunately, no. As a carer, and I think I might have covered that in one of the slides, as a carer, you're not legally entitled to reasonable adjustments. However, what the Equality Act does do is it does provide some protection for carers. So although you don't have a statutory right to reasonable adjustments under Section 13 of the Equality Act, you have the right not to be treated unfavourably or less favourably because of your association to a person with a disability, so caring for your children perhaps. And it would also probably be useful to check if there are any relevant policies in your trust that may be able to offer support.
Excellent. And there is one more.
Yep.
So whether or not the duty to provide reasonable adjustments applies to Royal Colleges and or deaneries for requirements to achieve CCT or to progress through training. That could be either exams or curriculum, workplace requirements. So for example, not being able to see a certain number of patients within a given time or clinic due to the need for more rest breaks and or shorter hours than colleagues. Would the college have to change a requirement to allow for CCT if you can prove a disability?
So the short answer is yes, they are still required to make reasonable adjustments, but because technically they're not always your employer, they're an educational organisation, the rules can be slightly different, but the short answer is yes, they are still required to make reasonable adjustments. And I go back to stress the requirement to obtain that medical evidence, because that medical evidence is incredibly crucial and can make the difference in being able to implement what reasonable adjustments are needed.
Lovely. There's another one just come in actually.
Okay.
What about additional annual leave with reasonable adjustments? Is that achievable?
It could be, but depending on your employer's policies, there could be other elements. So not many trusts employ disability leave as a feature, but it could be that there's discretionary leave depending on the facts that might be applicable. Dependent leave, again, it would always depend on the facts. But yes, the short answer is additional annual leave could be a reasonable adjustment.
Excellent. And then is there a standard to what is considered reasonable or not? Oh, sorry, what is reasonable and what isn't?
So to go back to the term reasonable adjustments, when we talk about reasonable adjustments, we consider how much it costs. Is it practical? Is it reasonable to secure, fund, or obtain? We also look at the nature and the size of the employer, but we've got to remember that the majority of the employers that we deal with are large NHS trusts. And we know that there's issues with funding, but that doesn't excuse them from funding, securing, or providing these reasonable adjustments. And if there is a cost element, there are programs and resources that we can access, such as the Access to Work scheme, to be able to fund that reasonable adjustment. Now, from memory, there's one or two cases that I've dealt with fairly recently that involved access to work, and where the employer, for whatever reason, said that they couldn't fund it, access to work funded it. So there wasn't really an excuse in these cases for the employer not to implement the adaptations or the specialist equipment, for example.
Fantastic. So with redeployment, do they need to consider a role at a similar level, or could you be put on a lesser role because of the disability?
So that's a tricky question to answer, again, because it always goes on a case by case basis, but it depends on the detriment. So if the change is needed or redeployment is a significant or has a significant impact on that member's terms and conditions, is a significant impact on their pay, then it may not be reasonable, and we would look to explore what other reasonable adjustments which minimize any impact on that member's terms and conditions could be implemented instead. I think that might be all the questions. I don't think there are any more that I can see.
There's one. I've just got a dog kicking off. How are employers able to dismiss disabled people on capability grounds if invoking attendance policies due to the absence, due to the disability, is discrimination?
Sorry, Sal, you cut off slightly there. Can I ask you to repeat that question, please?
Yeah. How are employers able to dismiss disabled people on the grounds of capability if invoking attendance policies, which would be either due to absence or disability, would that be discrimination?
In a nutshell, and remember, it always comes back to the facts of the case and on a case-by-case basis, but yes, if an employer subjects you, especially if it's an unfair and unjust formal capability or disciplinary process because of your disability or for a reason connected to your disability, and this is where the requirement to make reasonable adjustments is really important, because let's say, for example, you've been diagnosed with cancer and you have lengthy sickness absences, and it might be a case that you are returning, you might have a phased return to work, there's a process in place, some reasonable adjustments are being made, but then for whatever reason you're having to go off again, and it might be intermittent absences, and the employer says, well, it doesn't look likely that this person is able or can return, we'll simply subject them to a capability process or a dismissal process. Yes, that is still going to be disability discrimination because it comes back to the requirement to make reasonable adjustments. And remember, that can apply to policies and procedures. So if the policy, for example, says we only as a standard offer phased return to 1 month, that is a policy that can be amended and a reasonable adjustment can be made to that policy to extend it to the disabled employee.
Fantastic. And I think there is one final question. So where one trust offers particular adjustments, such as the removal of night shift, is that reasonable that other trusts would do the same?
In a nutshell, yes, because we have to remember that the NHS trusts are large employers, and even though there are problems with funding and staffing, if it is a reasonable adjustment that can be made for the individual. So remember, when we look at reasonable adjustment, it's what the individual needs, not whether it's going to be expensive or troublesome or cause a lot more work for the employer to secure cover, for example. It is what that disabled employee needs to be able to remain in work or return to work. I think that is all the time we have left. So hopefully, I hope everyone enjoyed that webinar and found it informative and educational. As I mentioned at the start, this is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube at a later date. Thank you.